This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello everyone and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage with an overview of the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. If you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. So, I just got back from vacation, ready to start breaking down the 2024 Barbarian, when I found a package with the Dungeon Master's Guide on my doorstep. Always looking to take advantage of the algorithm, I figured I'd cover my general thoughts on the DMG now before finishing off our series on the remaining classes. Now, with Practical Possibilities, my aim is to view content through the lens of practicality. What's likely to actually come up at the table, and how often will you find yourself using it? A great tangential example of this is the character names table in the back of Xanathar's Guide to Everything. When that book first came out, I came across a lot of criticism accusing that section of being filler or lazy or a waste of space. For those of you keeping up with the news, I don't know if any of that sounds familiar. And yet, that's the section of the book I think I've used more than anything else at the table. All this is to say that the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide was, in my opinion, not very practical. It had a lot of neat ideas. There are variant rules in there like spell points and facing that I currently use in my ongoing 5e campaign. But the old DMG felt like a loose collection of ideas that some experienced DMs might be able to integrate into their game, rather than an easy on-ramp for new DMs to be able to run great games right away. I know for a lot of DMs, including myself, the 2014 DMG isn't a must-have item. It was a while before I added it to my collection, and even then I received it as a gift. Well, according to Chris Perkins and James Wyatt, the two lead authors of the 2024 DMG, the entire project goal was to write the Dungeon Master's Guide in a way that made it feel necessary. And in my personal opinion, I think they succeeded. The advice within it, which was a collaboration between the authors from Wizards of the Coast and several well-known DMs like Matthew Mercer and Deborah Ann Wool, is all sound and well-organized. There is so much good stuff throughout this book that my initial draft for this episode consisted of breaking down each and every paragraph piece by piece, which would have led to an oversized episode that wouldn't be able to come together in any reasonable amount of time. So the way I'm going to tackle all of this is to give my thoughts on each chapter with a few standout elements that happen to catch my eye. Starting with chapter 1, the basics. I'd go so far as to say that this chapter should be required reading for any game masters of any system. It covers an overview of what a DM does, how to prep a session, how to discover your preferred DMing style, and how to go about setting expectations and content limits so that everyone, including you as the DM, has fun. If I were to write this chapter myself, this is exactly how I would have done it. To paraphrase Mike Shea from the Lazy RPG podcast, the chapter presents an argument for a certain style of play that may not be every DM's cup of tea, but in my personal experience results in the most amount of enjoyment across the broadest range of personalities. This is no better summarized than right from the first page of the chapter with the DM tips. Embrace the shared story. It's not a competition. Be fair and flexible. Communicate with your players, and it's okay to make mistakes. All right, I'm not going to veil this anymore. So while I was writing this draft, I came across something that's been being spread in the TTRPG community, which was Kobold Press writing a blog post basically criticizing the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I can't tell if it was a sincere review or if it was what everyone assumes, which was just a kind of marketing strategy to put down the DMG to lift up their own Game Master's Guide for Tales of the Valiant. But as I was reading it, one of the things that really bothered me was that their criticism was all about the game mechanic things that were missing in the DMG. The tone was like, oh, it's great for new players, but for experienced DMs, womp womp. And to be honest, I feel the exact opposite, especially when it comes to being a DM. To me, figuring out all the human stuff first is what sets you up for success. It doesn't matter if you perfectly prepare your ideal adventure or campaign. It doesn't matter what hazards you can plug and play into the adventure. What matters is paying attention to what your players enjoy and learning how to celebrate their ideas, as well as the unique alchemy between what you set up as the situation and then what their characters do with it. And that's what I think this DMG does well, especially in this first chapter. And that's also what I think Mike Shea means when he says that this chapter presents an argument for a certain style of play. In fact, 3 of these DM tips can pretty much be summed up with, it's okay to step out of character and talk with each other person to person. Whether it's a rules mistake you made, a misunderstanding of a description, or just wanting to step back as the DM to give your players more creative control, the stance that these tips are taking is that the game's enjoyment supersedes deep immersion. And I've personally been at tables where the opposite is the case, where rather than thinking through what's most enjoyable, there's this air at the table where there's a fear of doing the wrong thing, where above table communication was discouraged out of fear of metagaming, when really all someone wanted to do was just step out of the game for a minute, do a timeout, just to understand what was going on. And in the case I'm talking about, immersion techniques were prioritized out of balance of the real-world player's understanding of the situation. And because of that, it tended to lead to less enjoyable experiences than breaking character to just say, hey, I just want to say this so we're all on the same page. This is what I'm trying to get across. So yeah, I understand why immersion is what some people really enjoy about TTRPGs. But if immersion is getting in the way of at least 1 or 2 people's ability to enjoy the game, something else has to be addressed first. So also in this basic section, there's a sidebar on page 6 about scheduling games, where the book recommends that if you have a group that's new to D&D, to start with a one-shot just to test things out. For any of you familiar with my 7 baby steps to masterful game mastering, you'll know that I take this advice one step further. I recommend sticking with one-shots until your players have earned your trust that they'll be able to commit to a longer form game you want to play. Or, very relevant to this topic, if you're a new GM, don't start with some long-form campaign. Do a one-shot, close a story once before you start building on it. Almost every DM I've met has shared some story with me about getting really excited for some long-form campaign, only for it to fizzle prematurely because the players they recruited were unable to meet the scheduling demands that would make the campaign work. Although it may be frustrating as a GM, sometimes the best thing for your group and your game is to run your game one standalone episode at a time until you and your players are in a season of your life where all of you can commit more time to a longer form story. Page 8 has guidelines on preparing a session. While I've come across some reasonable criticism that this section is fairly bare bones, I do want to commend it on its focus on pace and real-world time. I found the 1-hour guideline to be fairly accurate. Quote, most groups can accomplish at least 3 things during 1 hour of play, where each thing might be any of the following: exploring a location, such as a chamber in a castle or a cave, conversing with an intelligent creature, reaching consensus on a divisive issue, solving a tricky riddle or puzzle, surviving a deadly trap, or fighting a low difficulty combat encounter. A more difficult combat encounter might count as 2 or 3 things. So what they're saying here is it might take an entire hour to do like a medium or high difficulty encounter. And a tense negotiation can use most or all of an hour of play on its own. Like the DM tips, I also find that this section is an argument for a certain style of play. For example, Step 1 of Prep says to create a bulleted list of key plot points to make sure a coherent story unfolds. I can already hear some DMs arguing that creating this linear bullet point list railroads the players, and I also know some DMs that may misinterpret this advice, thinking that if they don't create a linear adventure, they're doing things wrong. But I think really the idea they're trying to get across is just have a rough direction for the players to go in order to avoid wasting time just sitting around trying to figure out what to do next. In fact, something I like is that throughout this book, there's constant mention of preparing situations, another term I know Mike Shea loves using in terms of prep rather than stories. The situation is what leads to character choices, and those choices and their consequences are the shared story. The last section in this chapter I'd really like to dive into is ensuring fun for all. There's some great advice on setting expectations and how to go about establishing hard and soft limits. The thing I really keyed in on here, though, was the respect for the DM section. Basically, it acknowledges that the DM has a responsibility to prepare a situation that can be resolved in many ways, but the players also have a responsibility to play along with the situation the DM devised. It reminded me of a campaign I ran a few years ago, one where I kept offering plot hooks that the party just wasn't interested in. Now, in hindsight, there was a lot that went wrong with that campaign. From my end, I did a really bad job setting expectations ahead of time. And to also give myself a little forgiveness, I was one of 7 total people at the table. Yes, as the DM, as the leader, it was my job to communicate. And there were 6 other humans sitting around the table that also could have spoken up to help me organize everything. The 6 players had a responsibility for creating a story they'd enjoy. And I don't think any of us remember that campaign particularly fondly, if at all. It even became a joke in the finale session that I'd be like, oh, here's a plot hook, and the players would be like, nah. The lesson I learned for the next homebrew campaign I ran was just to ask the players, please take the quest I give you. It was a simple agreement, but one that put them in a different mindset that made our sessions the best that I've run. I also just want to shout out the section on players exploiting rules. There's outright acknowledgement that the rules are meant to facilitate the game, not to emulate real-world physics. Combat is for enemies, which is a reference to the bag of rats problem, where players would start trivial combat encounters just to roll initiative and recover some of their resources. My favorite is that rules rely on good faith interpretations. Again, there's acknowledgement that the rules as written may lead to some unclear resolutions or meanings, but the game is most fun when everyone agrees on an interpretation that's fair and fun for everyone. The goal shouldn't be to break the DM's game. The goal is for everyone to enjoy themselves by creating a spontaneously shared story with rules that help facilitate it. To reiterate, I think that Chapter 1 of the DMG is an excellent read if you're a game master of any system. Fortunately, it's on D&D Beyond for free as part of the 2024 free rules. So you don't even have to buy the book in order to get the most out of it. So, whereas Chapter 1 speaks most broadly about the role of DMing, as these chapters go on, the advice and tools get more and more specific to certain styles of play. So Chapter 2 is running the game, and we're getting real specific into how to effectively run the 3 pillars of play: social interaction, exploration, and combat. It also lays out the 8 common player preferences, very similar to what was in the 2014 DMG. There's advice to identify players that enjoy acting, exploring, fighting, instigating, optimizing, problem solving, storytelling, and a new one that they acknowledge, which is socializing. Socializing not being, I love the social interaction pillar. Socializing as in, I just like hanging out with my friends, and this just happens to be a fun way to do it. As a side note, as part of Chapter 1, there's a sentence that reads, optimizing is part of the game, but it can cross a line into being exploitative, interfering with everyone else's fun. Optimizing, or fine-tuning your character's mechanical performance, is something that many players, including myself, enjoy, but there is a line where you may start to step on the toes of another player's character concept. Again, while the DM has some responsibility in overseeing the balance of the group, each player also has the freedom to take it upon themselves to contribute a character that's fun for everyone. Other notes I want to highlight from this section: there's mention of DM PCs with explicit advice to keep the player characters in the spotlight and to avoid having the DM PC take away from the player's agency. This is also in the context of running small groups that don't have enough player characters to create a well-rounded party. Brevity, lengthy, flowery descriptions bore players. Distinguish clear, actionable options. Don't limit the options the player characters can take, and don't assume that characters do something. Be mindful of if a check is necessary. I first heard this advice from Jim Davis on WebDM, where overusing die rolls to resolve outcomes makes each one feel less special. On page 35, under Perception, as the DM, you're the interface between your players and the world of the game. You tell them what their characters perceive, so it's important to make sure you're telling them important information about their surroundings. A common DM mistake I've experienced is that DMs get so entranced by their own creative writing that they forget whether or not it's digestible for the players listening to it. Because again, we're listening to it, not reading it, unless you do a text-based play. There's also been times where DMs assume that they've been clear on a hint or clue, but are afraid to elaborate for fear of giving away some surprise, only for players to not understand what's happening and for the surprise to fall flat anyways. In terms of combat, there are a lot of things in here that make me feel validated about how I run combat. First is to measure monster HP in terms of adding the damage they've taken rather than subtracting from a total. This means you don't have to hide any numbers from your players. They just see how much damage they've dealt without knowing what the max total is. Another piece of advice is to hasten a monster's demise. If the combat has gone on long enough and the monster only has 15 hit points left, it may not be necessary to draw out attack rolls longer by hitting its max HP just because. Also in the book, to speed up combat, be generous with information. Tell your players the opponent's armor class and characteristics about the opponent as they fight it. For example, if the players are fighting a fire elemental, it's okay to tell them that the creature is obviously immune to fire damage. Again, I've had a lot of DMs get real itchy about being generous with information, and I can't tell if it's because they want to build suspense or if they think that being too generous with information somehow is playing the game wrong. But again, it all comes back to being clear to the players what their choices are, and also allowing them to solve the puzzle of a combat encounter in a way that feels sensical and logical. Chapter 3 is the DM's toolbox. I really don't have a lot to say on this one. This is an alphabetical collection of miscellaneous concepts that appeared in the 2014 DMG. They're like little sections for creating custom monsters, magic items and spells, rules for fear and mental stress, marks of prestige, poison. They're neat little plug-and-play type things. And this section being smaller than the 2014 DMG, I guess is what Kobold Press was upset about. But to be honest, this is the kind of stuff I tend to use the least. Even if you create a custom monster, a lot of times the CR rating is a ballpark to begin with. I'll be curious to see if it's a more accurate estimate when we see the 2025 DMG, but I like thinking of this chapter more as inspiration and just something else to think about, rather than necessarily plugging it in as written. Chapter 4 is about creating adventures. This is where they describe the 4 tiers of play with tables of situations that offer inspiration for hooking in player characters to your adventure. This is also the chapter that introduces the XP budget for combat encounters. In the 2014 DMG, there were multipliers and complex systems that went into calculating your XP budget that you could spend on different monsters to create a combat encounter of a difficulty you wanted. The budget system is a lot simpler now. You just have a set budget based on the encounter difficulty and the level of the player characters, and you just directly spend them on monsters without needing to multiply anything or get too fancy. We won't really know how accurate the system will be until we get the monster manual in February, but my prediction is that it'll be more accurate than 2014. But probably still a ballpark estimate, just because of the variance that different builds bring to the table. The end of this chapter, which I really like, has example adventures. They go from being half a page to a full page of notes, but nothing more than that. What I like about this is a lot of times I feel that new DMs look at a published adventure like Curse of Strahd or Tomb of Annihilation, and they think to run a good campaign, they have to start with that many notes. But the reality is, to just run a fun session, you kind of just need a handful of encounters, a general goal that the players are trying to reach, and maybe some NPCs to explain what the quest is. Of course, you can always get fancier, but I find that especially for new DMs, the problem is they flesh out the story they want told ahead of time, rather than thinking through a situation that can be the foundation for a lot of different stories. Chapter 5 is creating campaigns. This chapter goes over different genres, session zeros, and ways to connect adventures together. An interesting thing to note here is that there's a table of official D&D settings as examples to pick from, including Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms, Planescape, and Theros. Now, in the 2014 books, there was mention of Birthright, and that's not on this list, but Dark Sun is, which is curious because it wasn't that long ago that, I want to say Kyle Brink, but it might have been another Wizards of the Coast employee, was talking about how they weren't going to touch Dark Sun again because it was too problematic, which I understand, but this table is far from a comprehensive list. And every setting on here besides Dark Sun already has a product for 5th edition. So I just thought it was interesting they put Dark Sun on it because they have in the past kind of teased future products by embedding them as like little Easter eggs in a product that they release. So maybe we will see Dark Sun in the future. Who knows? Just like how there are sample adventures in Chapter 4, Chapter 5 has something that was really hyped up in the marketing, which was a reintroduction of Greyhawk. From what Chris Perkins said, the original Greyhawk box set had a setting guide, which was about 30 pages, the same amount that was put into this DMG. I think that this is a neat way to introduce newer players to D&D's legacy, but more importantly, I think it serves as a great example of, again, how much work needs to be put into a campaign setting before starting. Even 30 pages might actually be a lot. I know some DMs that have hundreds and hundreds of pages detailing and fleshing out their worlds. So much so that when players start interacting with it, it really limits what the players can contribute. I just throughout this book, a great question that's posed over and over again in the background. How much do you really need to get started? And I think that the answer that this book is pushing for is less than you might think. Chapter 6 is the cosmology. It dives into the different planes of existence like the Feywild and the Shadowfell, and ways you can reconfigure or customize the outer planes to the liking for your world. In the 2014 DMG, this was part of the first chapter, which focused on world building. Throughout my time DMing, world building has been a frequent focus of many DMs I speak with. One content creator I came across attributed this to the fact that the 2014 DMG leads with world building front and center, which I guess to many people suggested that that was the most important part of being a DM. I don't know if I totally buy this line of thinking, but I think that there's something to it, and I'm appreciative that the bigger world building sections in this DMG are pushed farther and farther to the back. The skills necessary for being a skilled GM have everything to do with navigating the game's social contract. World building is a way to deepen your foundation once it's established. To use a cooking metaphor, I use Penzeys Fox Point seasoning in my shepherd's pie. Is it necessary for the recipe? No. If I didn't have it, shepherd's pie would still be pretty yummy. However, granted that all the other ingredients are in place, the flavor added from the seasoning elevates the entire experience. If I just had the seasoning on my own, though, it wouldn't be good either. The metaphor here being like, if you do all this world building and don't pay attention to the social contract, it doesn't matter how elaborate your world building is. Your players aren't likely to have fun with it. Like cooking, I find world building is a great pop of flavor when everything else is working well. Cosmologies in particular. I know entire settings that are built off of this concept, like Planescape, or like Distal, which is a project my friend Rel is developing. However, this is a specific flavor, not something that's necessary to run any great game. Chapter 7 is the treasure, which is also the magic item compendium. Like with classes and subclasses in the player's handbook, the first thing that stood out to me was the new art added for various magic items. A lot of the magic item weapons, like flame tongues and frost bands, have expanded weapon types. For example, flame tongues can be any melee weapon, while frost bands can be any glaive, greatsword, longsword, rapier, scimitar, or short sword. I know that I and other DMs have been re-flavoring weapon enchantments for a while, but it's nice to see it get official recognition and support. Of interest to fans of the D&D cartoon, not only do the cartoon characters appear in art throughout the book, including the cover, but each of their magic items are included as well. Finally, Chapter 8 is about Bastions, a new subsystem introduced in 2024 where players can create their own home bases, doubling as both a source of additional resources and a method to teach them how to be mini DMs. To be honest, I'm kind of neutral on Bastions. This might be a really fun thing for a lot of tables. Personally, I don't see myself really using them a whole bunch. The concept maybe, getting a home base and getting to renovate it or build on it. But the specific rules, But I do like how, if you look at it one way, the DMG kind of follows the 7 baby steps to masterful game mastering. Start with one-shots, learn the social contract, get a little fancier, add with the running the game, try out a story arc. Then once we get into campaigns, things open up, then get into world building and homebrew. And then finally, maybe other players become interested in being DMs themselves, which is what the Bastion system is largely about, showing players that being a DM isn't as scary as it looks. So, big question to wrap things up. Is the new Dungeon Master's Guide worth the money? Is it worth putting in your collection? Especially if you're a new DM. My opinion is yes. If you're a veteran DM, there aren't going to be a lot of plug-and-play options. However, I think the advice is still really, really good. This is a book that I think is extremely valuable, and it's going to be very helpful while you're prepping your game, but it's not one that I think that you would need to take with you to the table. So in terms of at-the-table practicality, I don't think you need it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a use in how you run your games. One thing I do want to note here that I think is kind of interesting, reading through the 2024 Player's Handbook, I feel more or less that the 2014 Player's Handbook is obsolete. Everything is just so much better organized, balanced, designed in 2024. And if I were to predict for the monster manual, I'm going to feel the same way in February, that all the new monsters that are presented and the redesigned monsters are going to make my 2014 monster manual feel obsolete. I don't feel that way about the Dungeon Master guides, though. The 2024 DMG is way better for new players to learn how to become DMs. And what it doesn't have that the 2014 DMG has is a lot of the variant and experimental rules that can spice up or fine-tune your game. So if you already have the 2014 DMG, I'd be hesitant to get rid of it too quickly. I think both serve their place, and while there is some content overlap between both of them, I do think there are some hidden gems in 2014 that are worth keeping around. Overall, seeing the quality of both the 2024 PHB and DMG, it just makes me more excited than ever to see what the 2025 Monster Manual has in store for us. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragonmind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast Community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Fesliyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at fesliyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, and the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.